Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. Donald Trump and his administration are learning, in real time, the brutal choreography of the old-school Washington scandal. Each effort to distract or deflect only deepens the intrigue, and the whole affair metastasizes, taking on a lurid momentum of its own. The Teflon coating looks gone, if it ever repelled the allegations swirling around Trump's long-standing and still murky association with Jeffrey Epstein, likely the most infamous pedophile in U.S. history. Trump has tried indifference, anger, misdirection, hectoring, and the ultimate, laying it at the feet of Barack Obama. And the net effect has been only to dig a much deeper hole, one that it's not clear how he escapes. His rash, ill-advised lawsuit against the Wall Street Journal, whose bombshell reporting on Trump's vulgar 50th birthday letter to Epstein lit the match, has only set him up for a slow drip disaster when the Journal reveals, as it inevitably will, that it has the goods. Now, in a truly jaw-dropping abuse of power, he has conscripted his own Department of Justice in what can only be described as a personal political damage control mission. In a bizarre turn that redefined the role of Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanched was dispatched to Florida for a closed-door one-on-one interview with Ghislane Maxwell, Epstein's convicted co-conspirator. Yet even as the scandal shows signs of real staying power, something almost unheard of in Trump's long history, he presses forward with his autocratic crusade. Columbia University and CBS have paid what amounts to protection money to stay in his good graces. And the abrupt cancellation of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, a ratings leader and a nightly thorn in Trump's side, feels like it was ripped straight from an authoritarian's manual. To walk us through a scandal that is rapidly unfolding, and unlike so many before it, seems to be sticking to Trump and his allies, along with the increasingly frantic attempts to deflect, distract, and derail the public's attention, we are joined by three of the sharpest minds in the game, all, I'm proud to say, Talking Fed stalwarts. And they are Susan Glasser, a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she writes the weekly column on life in Washington. She previously served as editor of several Washington-based publications and is the author of a number of books, including The Divider with Peter Baker, which we covered in a Talking Books episode a few months ago. Welcome, as always, Susan.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be with you.
Adam Klasfeld, a leading courtroom reporter and editor-in-chief of All Rise News. For more than a decade, he's covered the top stories and court cases from state, federal, and military courts, and he frequently appears with me on Substack Lives in the wake of developing stories from the courts. Adam, a pleasure to have you again.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
And Bill Kristol, the editor-at-large at The Bulwark, also founder and director of Defending Democracy Together and host of the excellent video series and podcast, Conversations with Bill Kristol. Bill, thank you so much for joining as always.
Good to be with you, Harry.
I want to set things up. We're now in week 2 at a minimum of the Epstein scandal. And Susan had a really interesting argument in her most recent New Yorker piece, where she says that there is one Washington art that Donald Trump has perfected, and that's scandal management. He's turned what would have once been disqualifying to any other president into background noise that feels like just another Tuesday. But this one is different. The president is enmeshed in a genuinely metastasizing scandal over his ties to the disgraced and deceased sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. But this is Trump we are talking about, and says, Susan, this scandal, I regret to inform you, is not on the level. Let's just start there.
Well, first of all, it just seems so glaringly evident and so painful that Donald Trump's administration is a scandal every single day, right? And that is this sort of awkward political reality that we're dealing with. And none of it sticks, right? I mean, 4 indictments, 2 impeachments, blowing past laws and rules and norms every single day, monetizing the White House, ignoring and flouting court orders, attacking judges, right? On and on we can go with the list. So I feel that it's really important to start out with that, right? Because why is it that this saga of a dead convicted sex offender 6 years ago is now the thing that is embroiling Donald Trump in, what has all the hallmarks of a classic Washington story? The cover up not only appears to be real, but it's growing day by day. We have the classic infighting in the administration and, administration officials attacking each other. And I think it's incredibly revealing, first of all, about what can possibly harm Trump, because it seems to me it's almost a metaphysical question. When is a scandal? Is a scandal? Is a scandal? Well, when there's at least the presumption or the possibility or the notion of some kind of accountability or political harm or censure that attaches to it. And so part of the reason why so many of these other things aren't scandals is because Donald Trump truly does not give enough about many of the institutions that might have been capable in the past of censuring him. And so then what does he care about? He does care about his own political support, his MAGA base. He's oriented his entire presidency, not once but twice, around what you might call serving the base, at least in a political sense. And it also gives us a basic political truth, live by conspiracy, die by conspiracy, right? That he is not just a victim of a kind of revolutionary zeal eating its own, but in fact, you see here that Donald Trump is both the leader of MAGA, but also a follower of it. And by unleashing conspiracy theories about Jeffrey Epstein that he was not capable of delivering on as president, because they then conflicted with his own very serious political risk of exposing himself further as a friend and perhaps a better of Jeffrey Epstein. For Donald Trump, we always know in the clash between political interest and self-interest, he's going to pick self-interest. But I think this is a story about those politics. But I have to say, it just repulses and disgusts me that this is the scandal we're talking about, because I would love to talk about the real scandals that are, destroying the country. And so in that sense, it's another classic Trump era gaslighting us all, because here we are talking about these awful, repulsive, horrid, disgusting people. And, their dead ringleader and, Donald Trump, the friend of this awful, disgusting, repulsive person. And so it's a real conundrum for us, I think.
Part of the reason I think that this is resonating, this is something that he has cultivated for years. He has ginned up paranoia about the deep state, that his enemies are part of some secret, shadowy cabal of elites that are, one, opposed to him, that is, the QAnon dogma, and two, that they are absolutely devious. In QAnon dogma, they're a shadowy cabal of pedophiles, and in some of the darker corners of the internet, child eaters. So I think part of the reason this is sticking more than it otherwise would is beyond the scoops of the Wall Street Journal showing that letter in his name in Jeffrey Epstein's notebook, and we can talk about that later. This is something that has upset a large part of his base that he and his movement has cultivated. And I think that that's what makes this different, that after months of saying we're going to get to the bottom of this, that really nauseating, frankly, image of Pam Bondi holding a presser at Main Justice with the MAGA influencers holding binders saying declassified Epstein files. Now, by the way, not a single classified document has ever, to my mind, been publicly reported in connection with the Epstein investigation. Those files in particular happen to be fully public documents from Maxwell's criminal trial. They were all court exhibits. But just to think about that picture, smiling photos with MAGA, really pleased as punch about their access to this top secret information, these supposedly declassified files, to go from that to an undated, unsigned memo saying in sum and substance, nothing to see here, and one thing after another, showing Trump, one, pointing out the long acknowledged fact that he was close with Epstein for more than a decade and advancing that story with a really troubling letter. I think there's a reason why this one sticks.
That's right. What Adam says, a lot of this in rough outline, we kind of knew. We sort of knew about his friendship and palling around in some sense in which he was a fellow traveler. So is the heat on Trump now for what he may have done or what he may be hiding? And if it's the latter, about other people, he's a master betrayer of people. What does he care? Why would he keep any secrets?
No, I think it's both, and that it's the intersection of the two. And it goes beyond the MAGA base. I think it started off as a big problem for him because the MAGA base was uncertain about how to think about this because they've been so educated about QAnon, and Epstein was a pretty important part of the QAnon narrative. It was kind of the one, I would say, germ of truth in that narrative, actually, which is to say there was a genuinely repulsive and disgusting sex ring among elites and people knowingly or maybe sort of not knowingly or not wanting to know knowingly, if that's the phrase, were in and near it. And then he gets a slap on the wrist in 2008. And then it takes really intrepid reporting by Julie Brown of the Miami Herald to bring it back. He does get indicted in 2019. Maxwell then indicted and convicted in 2021. So I think it's important for his fractured his own base, which almost never happens. But it's really gone way beyond that, I think. And it deserves to go beyond that. I'm not one of those. I don't agree with Susan, who's sort of, well, it's not really, really, really a scandal. It is really a scandal for two reasons, or the intersection of two things. The crimes are horrible. I mean, it's not like Access Hollywood. That was bad. And he probably indicated that Trump's general behavior is horrible. And there are many other instances of that. Still, it was something he said. He couldn't really prove quite what it could be dismissed as locker room talk. This is not, these were horrible crimes. And he was close to them. And now we've learned he was maybe a little more knowing about them than even what some people thought. I always thought he probably sensed what was going on with Epstein. I think a lot of people had the sense it was kind of disreputable, but if you didn't look too closely, maybe you could get away with being his buddy. And in that respect, the card has not been taken seriously enough. I mean, I don't believe there's a credible interpretation of that birthday card, except that Trump basically knew at least minimally knew what was going on with Epstein and sort of didn't want to close his eyes a bit, wink and nod, but may have been more than that. So the crime is horrible. And now he's president of the United States. Most of his past cover-ups, Stormy Daniels, Access Hollywood, before he was president, I mean, he as a private citizen, he's been good at paying people off, bullying people and stuff. It's a little different to have the entire Justice Department and FBI of the United States government first engaged in a very vigorous investigation, and the Times report this week really makes that clear. And then secondly, then somehow he gets briefed by Bondi, even in this rather credulous account, in my opinion, that the Times printed, of, well, it's just a meeting, and and it was kind of routine, just a briefing. They took a little bit, maybe more than they might have, the White House spin on this, but I think it was maybe wise of them to do so because then they're sort of bending over backwards to be sort of respectful. Anyway, Bondi tells him in early May, you're actually mentioned several times in these files. And, there's some hearsay, but of course it's all hearsay. A lot of people, this hearsay. Trump knows what he did. Trump hears that and decides, no, they were going to put out the report. I mean, that's pretty clear, right? Bondi and Patel intended, as Patel said himself, quite late, even into, I guess, early June. Well, we're going to put out something, who knows what it would look like and so forth. And then Trump basically says, you can't put it out. The idea that this was a Bondi-Patel decision, they deliberated, they kind of put their heads together, thought about the public interest and the national, what's good for the country, and just decided, we don't really want to put something out. That is total nonsense. Trump said, don't put something out. Bondi and Patel put out this unsigned statement, as Adam said, that sort of says, nothing to see here.
And made them look terrible.
So, well, she had said as Attorney General, Adam was ridiculing correctly that thing, not ridicule, also being sort of disgusted by that thing at the Justice Department because it's so demeaning to the Justice Department that she did that. But she did it as Attorney General of the United States. So the Attorney General of the United States said, we're putting this out. Patel says, as FBI director, we're putting this out. There's a meeting with Trump. Suddenly they're not putting it out. I think it's perfectly reasonable to say this seems extremely suspicious. Why are they not putting it out? If it's all just kind of gossip and hearsay, he would survive that with no problem at all, right? And so makes you wonder what is in these documents. And incidentally, I think Trump kind of knows what's in there since he, knows what he did. And especially after that birthday card came out, that's already out now. If that was the worst thing you'd think Trump would say, okay, you know what, put the rest out, because what's the point at this point if I get credit for putting it out at least, right? Except now he's still hanging tough on the cover-up. And indeed, they're now accentuating, accelerating the cover-up. We now have the Deputy Attorney General meeting with Maxwell and so forth. So he is all in on the cover-up of a bunch of documents, which he was told he is in as a person, pre-presidential, and which we know could minimally be embarrassing and could well be worse. So it's a genuine scandal, I think.
Well, and he's got the DOJ in on it to his neck. We'll talk about this more, but just a quick lawyer's point is, under at least the old regime that they've sort of laid waste to, if there's an investigation going on, telling him that his name is in the files, absolutely verboten. They did it anyway. And if there's not an investigation going on, then that just sort of underscores it's all a political mission. Many of you have remarked that they're lurching from strategy to strategy, and it only seems, as Bill said, to be expanding the circle of the scandal. I just want to move to this Maxwell interview. Yesterday, the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, we tape on Friday, spent the day alone without another agent with her where she's doing 20 years. And he's doing it again today. Her lawyer, who's a good friend of his, remarked on how productive it has been. What the hell is going on? How, if at all, does it fit into the enforcement of the laws, which is the deputy's lookout? And how can they sort of get away with this in plain sight?
He's serious about the cover-up, and he does not want those files to come out. And in this respect, I think it is. Of course, I understand Todd Blanched is down there in Florida, and I'm happy to talk about Todd Blanched too. He's down there because Donald Trump wants him down there. He didn't decide, I think I'll fly to Florida. I'll have a little chat with Maxwell. So they are in a serious cover-up. I'm very worried about the next 6 weeks. Because I think Trump has a sense if Congress comes back in September and this thing is still at this heat, he does have real political problems on the Hill, and that he does care about. He needs the Republican support, which he's had so consistently for the first 6 months of his presidency. So he wants to damp it down. I don't think it's out of the question that, they destroy files. I don't think it's out of the question that they manufacture fake files and say that Biden and Obama administrations put them in there. They are desperate for the cover-up, which makes me think it's that the underlying documents or whatever, photos, something that are in the files could be very, very damaging to Trump. I assumed when the whole thing started that it was a fake investigation. I assumed they were trying to satisfy the base because it's so central to QAnon conspiracy theories. I just would make one distinction. Epstein is not a conspiracy theory. Epstein is a horrible criminal who was convicted once, plea bargained once, would have been convicted again, killed himself, presumably, and his associate Maxwell was convicted. So that's real. The theories maybe about the suicide are maybe a little crazy, and then the rest of QAnon's crazy, but the culpability of elites in covering it up is real, in my opinion. The whole thing is a disgrace, and I am now totally on board a massive, attack on elites of both parties just because I'm so disgusted by a lot of the elites, incidentally, who were like, well, this doesn't really matter. Come on. What was one supposed to do about this? The guy, really? People knew what was going on or had a sense of what was going on. Anyway, I assume Trump sold Bondi, do a quote investigation, decide there's nothing there. Let's get this done, and then we'll just let it go away. I don't know quite if Trump wasn't paying attention or was overly cocky, or Bondi and Patel just took it more seriously and Trump wasn't paying attention, and suddenly they have 1,000 FBI agents pouring through these files. And it's pretty clear when they told Trump about this, Trump was kind of, what are you kidding me? You actually went through these files and now you're thinking of putting them out, and I'm mentioned in some of them. And he just shut it down. So he shut it down. It didn't quite stay shut down. So now he's got to think of other ways to keep it shut down. So I think there will be more and more pressure to make the files with appropriate redactions and so forth. None of the photos and pornography and the names of the victims and obviously any identification about them taken out. But I was once a little sympathetic to the, innocent people are mentioned in the files. I don't actually care anymore. You know what? If they're mentioned, they're mentioned. If someone says in the files, third party, I don't know, that Epstein once told me he saw Bill Kristol or Harry Littman on TV and thought of inviting in somewhere, would that be embarrassing to be in the thing? Fine. I get some calls from some reporters. I'll say I never met the guy. I never went anywhere, obviously. And that's that. I think it's a serious enough scandal now that we do need some transparency. And we have gotten that in previous scandals, incidentally. We do kind of know what happened ultimately in Watergate and Iran-Contra and in Lewinsky, for that matter. And I do think that's one reason why it doesn't go away. People are kind of used to the story of the cover-up. They're used to at least some. No, you might resolve it and not as in Iran-Contra and say nothing. The president doesn't get impeached, of course. But as I said, with this president controlling the federal government the way he does, it's going to be harder to find out as much. But I do think that's why it stays alive. But I do think sending Blanched down to Florida is a pretty big sign of genuine concern. I mean, obviously I assume they're going to try to work out some way that isn't mind-bogglingly obviously just supporting telling an untruth. I guess it wouldn't necessarily be legally perjury. That, to have Maxwell give Trump kind of a vague clean bill of health and somehow let that out and dangle the promise of a pardon or clemency before Maxwell for post-26 or 28 elections. So, and Blanche is probably a good enough lawyer to do all this without quite saying it, in those words and so forth. Maxwell's a smart enough person to realize that's what's going on. But it shows how he is a little desperate. And why would he be desperate if there's nothing terrible in the files? I just keep coming back to that. Why would he be desperate? He's not an idiot. He as Susan said, he can take the hits, if it's just a bunch of if it's more of these embarrassing personal, like he was too chummy with Epstein, that's already known. So I wonder what's in there.
A couple quick prosecutors' points before turning it over. So first, I just can't emphasize enough how completely irregular Blanche's little junket here is. The Deputy Attorney General doesn't leave the building. She or he runs the building and maybe an occasional keynote address, but going there at all, doing any kind of interview without an agent and agents around and to take notes, that's just complete prosecutorial investigation 101. But the main thing is, what the hell business of the DOJ is he actually executing? To Bill's point, let's say she comes out and says something that's useful to Donald Trump. She's going to want something. Now, when a defendant or someone who's convicted gives information, that's to the value of the United States, right? To convict someone else or the like. This is a naked effort to just give me something good for Donald Trump to use to counteract. One more thing, I'm sorry, that I did want to add, which is it's not just what's in the files. When this sort of scandal happens, and you've compared it to Watergate, other things come out in just the last few days. We have the revelation from the estate. There's another copy of the notebook. We have the ex-girlfriend of Epstein saying they were thick as thieves. We have a victim coming forward with gross behavior by Donald Trump. So the drip, I think there are several faucets now.
To your point, Harry, I think this really signals that this is now in the hands of Donald Trump's criminal defense attorney. And the fact of the matter is, Blanche didn't only take the lead in this irregular interview of Ghislane Maxwell, he also took the lead in this bizarre, out of left field, we'll put transparency over the grand jury files. Now, when they moved to unseal those files in New York federal court, two judges wrote an identical sentence, and the sentence was, the government may not have notified the victim. So I reached out to an attorney for the late now Virginia Giuffre and hundreds of other victims.
Who committed suicide, a victim who committed suicide.
Yes. And Sigrid McCauley made clear the government did not they failed to notify the victims. She represents hundreds of Jeffrey Epstein victims, including the most prominent, Maria Farmer. We ran that story just because, it's not every day you see two federal judges saying the government may not have notified the victims. And one more thing with Todd Blanche going to Florida, to Tallahassee, to have this irregular 2-day interview with Ghislane Maxwell, who was charged with 2 counts of perjury. And the reason that she isn't convicted of 2 counts of perjury is because they convicted her of sex trafficking before they got to the perjury part of the trial. So I want to just read a part of her indictment, the perjury counts, what she was accused of lying about. She said in a deposition with the late Virginia Giuffre, who died by suicide, as you mentioned, Harry, a deposition in her lawsuit. Did Jeffrey Epstein have a scheme to recruit underage girls for sexual massages? If you know. She replied, I don't know what you're talking about. In a separate deposition, she claimed that she had never given anyone a massage. And I was covering the Southern District of New York when Jeffrey Epstein was indicted. I sat through every day of Ghislane Maxwell's trial. And so I know that there was wrenching testimony by multiple witnesses that she was both present during massages where sexual abuse was committed. She was accused of participating in the sexual abuse during those massage sessions. The only named victim who didn't testify anonymously, Annie Farmer, said that Ghislane Maxwell, made her disrobe before giving her a massage and touching her chest. And so that's the testimony. And so the person who Todd Blanched is interviewing was charged twice with lying about basic facts that were exposed as lies during this trial, where she got her sex trafficking conviction.
And I would just like to point out, just to reinforce that, unfortunately, the pardon is not some speculative thing. Donald Trump, actually speaking to reporters before he went off on a trip to Scotland over the weekend, already essentially did the Donald Trump dangle of the pardon, saying, well, it's not something I'm doing right now, but I have the power to do it. And did I mention I have the power to do it? And I noted before this conversation that Maxwell's attorney has already been on cable news today, subsequent to Donald Trump dangling the pardon, saying, well, we haven't talked actively with them about a pardon yet, but of course we hope that they'll do the right thing. And so, again, to your point, Harry, this is playing out essentially a corrupt negotiation between a deputy attorney general whose inherent conflict of interest from the day he was appointed was that he had served as the president of the United States' personal attorney. Is this negotiation between these parties is taking place in plain sight. And I think that's the other big takeaway here, right? Is that there's the politics, which we started out talking about, but then there's, I think, the even more corrosive aspect of this, which is that Donald Trump has turned the government of the United States into a collection of personal toadies to him, retainers, yes men and yes women, and people who would never have these jobs in any reputable Republican or Democratic government. And so they owe everything to him, their position to him. And I would just like to wrap in a third aspect, which we can talk about or not, which is that in the effort to cover up whatever happened inside the DOJ and the FBI that stopped them from releasing these documents they were clearly intending to release, in the effort to distract and to move on from that, you've now created a whole other set of lies, conspiracies, and government misrepresentation and abuse of power that are all in service of the cover-up, which is the classic, again, Washington scandal machinery cranking up. So you have Tulsi Gabbard abusing her position as the director of national intelligence, rolling out a whole set of lies and allegations and untruths and mistruths and half-truths, and a propaganda campaign that she's mounting around that to try to bring up the whole question of Russia's intervention in the 2016 election on Donald Trump's behalf as a way of distracting these enraged MAGA supporters, and also of gaining the president's favor once again, because Tulsi Gabbard was out of Donald Trump's favor. He even cut her out several meetings, it appears, in the run-up to his military strike on Iran's nuclear facilities earlier this summer. And I bring this up because I think, again, do I think that our national political conversation should be talking about, who said what when about a massage decades ago of an underage girl? No, it's horrible. And I'm glad that Ghislane Maxwell's in jail. I'm glad that Jeffrey Epstein, before he died, was prosecuted and sent away to prison. It's awful. And all of those prominent men who, wink, wink, nod, nod, participated in it, as Bill said, let them be humiliated. They deserve to be humiliated for participating in this. But, our society abuses women on a massive scale. Let's be honest about that. Okay. And I would rather talk about the fact that there's an entire administration that has essentially perverted the structure of our government to be responsible and to be loyal to the personal interests of one man. And this is an example, unfortunately, of a case where the interests of the president in the United States very radically diverge from the public interest and the national interest. And I think you're seeing his lackeys jump to in the effort to defend him and not the country.
These are great points. So I just want to add a couple things. First, I think what you've just said in the last sentence really is the core of the story here. It's not just that he's installed lackeys, but lackeys who are willing to, violating their oaths, redefine the interests of government as what is best for Donald Trump and to do it nakedly. Second, I just want to say as to that new ancillary scandal that you've defined, the ripples, this, in classic Washington terms, tell one person, you tell 100. Kash Patel's been out there saying that Trump was in the files, et cetera. If this becomes the focus, how many people can come forward, what kind of conflict within the Bureau, et cetera. And then finally, on this pardon point, I mean, the woman's doing 20 years. What are they going to give, 2 years off as you would give for a little cooperation? It's right? She's got to be trying to shoot the moon. And if he lets her do it, maybe with some creepy as he leaves office kind of deal, I don't know that she can possibly give him enough that would justify that total hit on his legacy, such as it is. I just want to follow up brief because, Bill, you've been there in crisis-beset White Houses, and you made a point in your recent piece in Bulwark. You draw the parallel between what's going on and Watergate. Can you walk us through why you think that is an apt comparison of where things stand now with what I think we all think of as the granddaddy of them all, White House scandals?
Well, I think for the reasons Adam and Susan both said really excellently in the last round. I mean, the cover-up is proceeding, and these cover-ups are hard, it turns out, and you tend to use one thing to try to fix a problem you have, and it creates new problems. You get worse within the administration. One of the striking things in the journal piece, which is pretty careful in sourcing, in the sense that it ascribes, kind of slightly unusually, I'd say, different paragraphs are ascribed to different sources. As they obviously want to be very, very careful.
So important, though, that it's not just that it exists, but that DOJ has examined it and stuff.
Yeah. So they have the argument, the screaming argument between Banino and Bondi is ascribed to a senior administration official, not to the usual someone familiar with Bongino's thinking or someone who was told about it, right? So a current, apparently, senior administration official is cheerfully either trying to trash Bondi or maybe trying to trash Bongino or both. I mean, and these things do tend to fall apart, these cover-ups, when people see their own interests start to diverge and so forth. So I think in that respect, it has a Watergate resonance. Again, I come back to this important point, though, and I'd really be curious what Susan and Nat, what you all think about this. The fact that Trump controls everything really changes it, right? I mean, there really isn't, with all due respect to Woodward and Bernstein, and they were great, there's no Watergate unraveling if you don't have the special counsel, whom Nixon realized that's why he fired them. But then, in fact, Bork appointed Jaworski 10 days later, and they went ahead, and the case before Sirica is brought, and people start to flip. And there's a Senate investigating committee, and Butterfield talks about the tapes, and then John Dean flips from inside. And so none of that happened. And the same would be true, incidentally, in other similar scandals, in the sense that the ones that ended badly for the incumbent administration seem always to have they had special prosecutors. And that's not because special prosecutors are magical or brilliant. It's because they have the force of law enforcement behind them and of the authority of the Justice Department. And they can bring people in and say, if you perjure yourself, you're in deep trouble. No one is doing that. I mean, this is Susan's point, right? We're so far down the road. And just to authoritarianism, because that's really what it is. If you don't have some kind of independent legal system, right, to oversee the president, we're so far down that road that it's just farcical to even say the word special counsel, except if it were appointed to investigate President Obama, But I mean, it's farcical to imagine that this Justice Department, again, unlike Nixon's and unlike in certain ways even Clinton's, and unlike the Trump first term. I mean, the first term, Jeff Sessions said, the ethics guy says I have to recuse myself. I guess I'll do that. And Rosenstein appoints Mueller. I mean, how far are we from that world? And then the Mueller thing, for all the threats.
The ethics officer now has been fired by Bondi.
Right. And for all of Bill Barr's, obfuscation of what the Mueller report was, it does come out. It is a real report. It's presented to Congress. It's not meddled with. Mueller isn't actually fired. And the FBI does whatever it does. The FBI director Comey's fired, but he's replaced by Wray, who seems to behave, honorably and so forth. And we're so far from that world. I guess that's what strikes me. And I really don't know. Maybe you could succeed in a cover-up. I mean, here's my question. Do we expect 6 months from now that we'll have any of the files? Or will they just be covering up, A, I don't know what the answer is, honestly, and B, if he is still covering up, will he be paying a price? Or will they just people be exhausted because they can scream all they want But if Trump and Pam Bondi and Blanche and Patel and everyone just hang tough, they can just kind of hunker down. And at least until November 26th, Congress doesn't make them do anything. No one now there'll be leaks. I guess there'd be people who might start saying things. Would the pressure get greater? I don't know. But I do think, I guess it brings home to me sort of the point Susan's been dwelling on, which is that we're already in such a different world that it's a little hard to know how this scandal plays out, I think, honestly. Now, I could also argue the other, that it's still a world where public opinion matters. It's still a world where there are people within the government who take their oath seriously. It's still a world where he has narrow majorities in Congress and people could start to flip. So there are courts. The courts are still pretty independent and they can have ways to be involved, I suppose. So I don't know how this plays out. But I think, again, the degree to which we already have a situation Watergate worked out because of the independence because Nixon couldn't pull it off, right? And Trump's already pretty far down a road that Nixon never got close to getting down.
There's so much to talk about here for weeks, but let me just ask Susan and Adam for your basic thoughts about the range of reasonable outcomes we are looking at here.
Look, I think the Watergate comparison that Bill makes is instructive largely for telling us how far down the road we've come to lack of accountability or even the meaningful prospect of accountability. And by the way, I would say it's not just because there's not a special prosecutor, special counsel who's going to be appointed to look into this, but Congress has abdicated its responsibility. Not only the Republican-led House and Senate that, are sort of tying themselves up in knots rather than get involved, but in a bigger picture sense, the mere threat of impeachment drove Richard Nixon from office. Donald Trump has now not only survived 2 impeachments, which is the only constitutional remedy for presidential abuse of power that is enshrined, and even more so that is the case given that the Supreme Court of the United States a year ago in the presidential immunity decision has basically said, our president can break the law and there's not a damn thing that anybody can do about it. And so given that we have a Supreme Court that is enabling lawlessness by the president and a Congress that has essentially broken its own power to serve as a meaningful check on the presidency, to me, it's those 2 things, even more than the lack of a kind of classic Washington investigative authority of some kind in this Epstein files case, that underscores why the Watergate comparison is kind of dead from my perspective, and we're just in a much more dangerous place. The only other thing I wanted to flag is about the Republican Party today. Because while I think it is notable and striking, and you could say even surprising in certain ways, how far down the road of sticking with their Epstein case they're willing to stick, even at the expense of beating, their orange hero over the head with it, I think there are many reasons to be deeply skeptical about whether this indicates a broader potential rift between Trump and the Republican base, or even the Republican elite, which Donald Trump has successfully taken over and, turned into his handmaidens. And the data point from this week that leapt out to me here is that I mentioned earlier Tulsi Gabbard's kind of new effort to introduce another distraction here. What did you have? You had 2 Republican senators who damn well know better, Lindsey Graham and John Cornyn, jumping into that bogus story and saying, yes, absolutely, Tulsi Gabbard, this is terrible. We should have a special prosecutor to look into this. John Cornyn, folks, John Cornyn was a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee chaired by Republicans with Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, and acting National Archivist to Donald Trump. Marco Rubio, as well as John Cornyn, signing this report saying that, sorry, Tulsi Gabbard, sorry, all you liars. Not only did Russia intervene in the 2016 election, it did so explicitly on Donald Trump's behalf. 5 volumes. And the fact that they can just repudiate the things that they put their own names to, that they spent, this Senate Intelligence Committee investigation went on for years. In fact, the final report wasn't even released until 2020 when it was sort of drowned out and a little bit underplayed because people were consumed by all the other catastrophes at the end of Donald Trump's catastrophic first term. And so I feel like it's really important to point that out because you might get the sense that this cover up is somehow going to ensnare Donald Trump. And I don't know what's going to happen that's somehow going to make the presidency crumble. But as long as he has support from craven Republican politicians like John Cornyn and Lindsey Graham, it's hard to see how that would happen given our system.
To your point, Susan, one thing that happened shortly before Lindsey Graham came out and said that, I think he had an interview on Fox News where he was opining on the likelihood of Obama being indicted. And he said he compared it to his likelihood of being in the NBA. And then after calls for the special counsel. So it's a uniquely Lindsey Grahamian moment of cynicism, even for him. To the broader point, I think you also hit the nail on the head, Susan, as to why this is important and why I think even if my expectations are set low for impact, this is going to be enduring. And the reason I think this is going to be enduring is a lot of this is outside of Donald Trump's hands. In the avalanche of Epstein-related news in the past week, one thing that didn't get much attention, the Second Circuit revived unsealing process in Giuffre v. Maxwell. The disclosures in that have been modest, but it guarantees that unsealed files will be in the news for quite some time. There is surely going to be other litigation, including litigation brought by Donald Trump against the Wall Street Journal and Rupert Murdoch that could ultimately proved pretty damaging for him because he made the claim that this letter is a total fabrication. It's totally false. And if that case moves forward, well, that will be tested through the discovery process. So there's stuff that, yes, everyone is correct in mentioning the dangerous moment that we're in, that the entire government and the top echelons of the Department of Justice are acting at Donald Trump's behest in this scandal. However, some aspects of this are now outside of his control, including by his own steps. So even if my expectations are set low as to impact, I think this story is properly in the news and will be in the news for a long time because it just shows beyond the scandal itself, beyond the pain of 1,000+ victims who are being dragged through all of this, it draws attention to the overarching fact of the government and the Department of Justice being operated for one man, the President of the United States.
There really are two dimensions to consider. One is the gravity and what comes out, but the other, I think you're really right to underscore it, Adam, is the longitude of it. He's already tried once, shut up you MAGites, and it didn't work. He's backed away. If it just the mere fact of the drip, 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 as Bill said, it is significant in itself. All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we uncork the notion of drinking bottled wine versus canned wine. Yeah, wine in a can. Wine connoisseurs may stay true to the bottle, but wine connoisseurs have adopted the untraditional packaging for its added convenience, ideal for picnics, concerts, and outdoor events, really anywhere corkscrews are scarce. And since aluminum cools faster than glass, it reduces the time it takes to chill your favorite Sauvignon Blanc. But swirling your wine in a glass does help it open up, which gives it a lot more flavor. Of course, you can always transfer your canned wine to a glass, but if you're looking to experience the subtleties of a nice bottle, drinking from a glass adds a lot. There are wines more suited to the bottle, and there are those well suited for the canned life. Crisp and sparkling whites and rosés in particular tend to fare best in cans, but bigger, bolder wines will usually benefit from a nice glass. It would seem both have their place. Still on the fence between bottles or cans? There's always wine in a box.
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine and More for today's A Spirited Debate. what a many-tentacled story, and I think it is going to continue to emerge. I don't want to ignore what's been, to my mind, a contrasting successful week for Trump, where he has made the signature move of Trump 2.0, which is the use of executive power as a cudgel to force changes in the behavior of social institutions. He's notched a few real achievements under our noses. I'm thinking of the Columbia University settlement. I'm thinking of the merger that they greenlighted now after pretty much shaking them down to settle the lawsuit. I'm thinking perhaps of the cancellation of the Colbert Show, and maybe even the renaming of the Washington Stadium. I mean, he's doing his Trump thing, and it's kind of a reminder that our best case scenario is to get out of here alive, us being the democratic constitutional rule of law, but with a hell of a lot of damage. Anyway, I wanted to solicit your thoughts about that and successes that I don't even think he tried in the first time around. Bill, let me start with you again, because you had some real thoughts about the Columbia settlement, more than $200 million to get them to back off. It's in contrast with what's happening at Harvard. How do you think we should view the development?
And Susan and I discussed this. We had lunch a few months ago, and Susan made this point, which I'll now make, and then let Susan elaborate on, which is, it is Trump, as you said, Harry, no question. And some of this, like the names of the football team stuff, is really more Trumpian. But it's basically not Trump. That's to say, it's classic authoritarianism, right? You bring the universities to heel, you intimidate the media, you make an agreement to a merger, which is supposed to be based on various, analytical things about competition and so forth. You make it contingent on them doing things you want in the news division. Susan was there in Russia at the time. That is kind of Putin. I hate to exaggerate. We're not there, thank God, and we're not going to get there, I don't think, but the authoritarianism is both within the government. We've discussed that quite a lot in terms of the Justice Department, FBI, everything else, Tulsi Gabbard, intelligence agencies. He's got the power ministries totally manned by subservient loyalists who aren't that competent in many ways, but still are pretty tenacious, you might say, in carrying out what Trump wants. And then some of them, like Miller and Vaught, are probably a little more competent, unfortunately. So he's got the internal authoritarianism. There's probably a technical term for this that Susan knows. And then he's got the external authoritarianism, which is bludgeoning the other institutions of society and of universities, business, media, to become more accommodating to him. You can't get all of them at once, but neither could Orban, neither could Putin, right? You get one oligarch at a time, you get one university at a time. I don't mean to exaggerate it, but it's pretty, if you put it all together, I think it's bad. It's bad.
Just, I guess, to speak up in defense of my own theory
Yeah.
of the game. But, I think this is an important point, Harry, and I'm actually really glad we're talking about it, because it's in the culture that a lot of the power of this kind of politics resides. And I think that's the reason that if you study history or look at the authoritarian playbook that's happened in other countries, it's not just the internal elite politics in the capital, right, that leaders occupy themselves with. It's that they occupy a greater and greater space and sort of piece of the mind share of their population, right? That they control goes not just from a narrow legalistic sense of control, but broader and broader into the leader has opinions on everything. Peter and my husband and I were just thinking so much after the cancellation of the Colbert Show. And I saw another friend of ours who is also a former correspondent in Moscow immediately tweeting the analogy that we thought of, which was the shutting down by Putin very early on in his tenure of a show by Russia's leading comedian, Viktor Shenderovich, who was, the sort of Colbert, John Oliver, all wrapped in one, huge figure in Russia. And every week in the Yeltsin era and then into the early Putin era, he did a political satire show called Kukli. It was with dolls that were like marionettes that looked like leading figures in the capital. So there would be a Boris Yeltsin doll and a Vladimir Putin doll and a Bill Kristol doll. It was, of course, like a sort of must-see TV for anyone who was interested in politics of that period of time. And it was brutal about Putin. It depicted him as a crude thug, a killer, talked about the war in Chechnya and other forbidden topics that they were then in the course of purging from the television news. And that cancellation of Kukli, that was the early warning indicator light. And of course, in all free societies, right, that's the difference. What do dictators want to do? They hate to be made fun of. They hate to be laughed at. And so if you told me in the Hollywood, version of Donald Trump 2.0 that they were sitting in the writer's room and they're like, I know, let's have him cancel the most popular late night comic, because he makes fun of him, you'd say once again, no, you can't do that. That's just too obvious. Like, of course, like petty wannabe dictator is going to force independent business to cancel mean comedian in order to get their deal approved. And, this is a very simple thing. It's corruption, it's extortion, it's authoritarianism. And every bad guy in every other country in the world has run this play already. So if we fall for it and we can't call it out for what it is, then we're not going to be able to resist it.
To quote the late, great playwright Edward Albee in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, none of the monoliths could take a joke. Read history. I know something about history. So says George in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. You're absolutely right. I mean, it's a sign of social dysfunction when the man in charge can't take a joke and turns that into policy. I echo all the points everyone here has made on the authoritarian threat. And I think back on Trump's first term. I was covering a multi-billion-dollar money laundering case that happened in the Southern District of New York and implicated the Turkish government. And the case interested a lot of people in Turkey. And so to see their perspective as they were following this case on trends that were going on at the time. I remember when Jim Acosta was yanked from the White House press pool and the way that there was a manipulation of the video of how it happened in order to vilify him. That was very familiar to people in the Turkish press. And so there are these patterns that play out in illiberal democracies. And if there's anything that gives me hope is that those trends always take a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to erode democratic institutions in far less robust democracies. And hopefully those institutions can withhold this ongoing assault much longer to mount a protection of those institutions, whether it's the press, whether it's the independent judiciary. That's where we're at.
That's where we're at. And I mean, we do have to consider and try to put our faith in, with cautious optimism, the robustness of our institutions. Look, Bill's got to be right. No way Trump thought of this stuff, nor have they invented it anew. I think Project 2025 sat down and said, took the ideas from history and other would-be authoritarians, put them all in, and Trump said, yep, that's great. Keep bringing them. Well, much more on both these points to come, but we are sadly out of time. Thanks so much to Adam, Susan, and Bill. We just have a minute for our final feature of 5 words or fewer, where we take a question and we all have to answer it in 5 words or fewer. And today is it's about the renaming craze of the Trump administration. He wants now to rename the football team, maybe the stadium. There's a move afoot that I'm sure he doesn't disagree with, to rename our National Opera House for the First Lady. So our question to answer in 5 words or fewer: what's the next thing that will be renamed, and what will the new moniker be?
The Jeffrey Epstein Department of Labor.
That's a great minds work. I was going to say the Jeffrey Epstein White House. Think big, Adam.
No, I have to disagree here. Donald Trump, there's only one name that Donald Trump likes emblazoned, and preferably in large gold letters. And I will say that actually, I'm not sure, I think it was the last cover of Politico magazine that we did when I was the editor of it, was a giant version of the White House, all redone in gold with giant Trump White House on the cover. And this was, of course, the joke version in 2016. And now we are 10 years into the joke having become reality. So I'm sorry, it's the Trump White House.
Gotta be Trump White House. Like a lot of things, it's not so funny anymore. Okay, I am going with the Enrique Tarrio Golden Gate Bridge. Thank you so much, Bill, Susan, and Adam, and thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts, and please take a moment to rate and review the show. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes and daily updates on top legal stories. Check us out on Substack, harrylittman.substack.com, where we're posting 2 or 3 bulletins a week breaking down the various threats to constitutional norms and the rule of law. And Talking Feds has joined forces with The Contrarian. I'm a founding contributor to this new media venture, committed to reviving the diversity of opinion that feels increasingly rare in today's news landscape, where legacy media seems to be tacking toward Trump for business reasons rather than editorial ones. Rest assured, we're still the same scrappy, independent podcast you've come to know and trust, just now linked up with an ambitious and vital project designed for this pivotal moment in our nation's legal and political discourse. Find out more at contrarian.substack.com. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine. Our associate producers are Luke Cregan, Becca Havian, and Katie Upshaw. Sound engineering by Matt McArdle. Rosie Don Griffin, David Lieberman, Hamza Mahadranathan, Emma Maynard, and Hallie Necker are our contributing writers, and production assistants by Akshaj Turbailu and Sebastian Navarro. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.